A Dog of Flanders. Chapter 4. The Land, the People. The three in their poor little hut were always glad when spring and summer came. To most, Flanders was not a pretty country, especially around Antwerp. A few flowers bloomed, but the field upon field of flax and grain retreated in dull monotony. Ribbons of pastures and ploughed fields followed each other in unending repetition. Except for distant church bells ringing at their appointed times of day, few new sounds broke the constant voices of the wind and the choppy waters of the canal. The only change of scenery might be a farmer carrying a load of sheaves in his arms, or a woodsman hearing his axe on his shoulder. The countryside seemed boring and uninviting, especially to any who lived in lush, mountainous country, or to those with an artistic flair. Nevertheless, Flanders was a very fertile land, flat and wide to the horizon. Along the canals and streams, flowers grew and trees rose tall and green on the banks. Otherwise, the canals held little interest. Great barges glided down them with their huge hulls black against the sun. Their varied coloured flags waved gaily against the trees. All these wide open spaces and green fields were beautiful to Nello and Patrache, though, for it was their home. They could ask for nothing better after a hard day's work than to lie in soft green grass beside the canal and watch the big vessels drift by. They seemed to carry the smell of the sea and add to the fragrances of a country summer. True, in the winter it was harder. Nello and Patrache had to rise while it was still dark and bitterly cold, and they seldom had what they could be considered a hearty breakfast. The hut was little more than a shed. In warm weather it looked pretty with vines and blossoms covering it. When nights were cold, however, the wind pushed through and chilled the dark room inside because the hut had many holes in its walls. Sometimes the floor flooded and then froze. Both the little village nearby and the countryside were bleak and dreary. The ground was frozen and cold, and snow covered the icy streets and paths. Nello's thin coat and cap offered little protection against the sharp wind, with his red fingertips poked through holes in his worn gloves. Blowing snow sometimes blinded him, while he trudged along beside Patrache. The rough, frozen ground often cut and bruised the dog's feet. Nevertheless, the two had their job to do, no matter how hard or uninviting, if they wanted to eat. Yet, in spite of hardships, neither of them complained. Nello in his rough wooden shoes and big lumbering Patrache on frozen paws trotted bravely together over the icy fields to the jingling of the bells on the leather harness. Sometimes, in the streets of Antwerp, some housewife would bring them a bowl of soup and a handful of bread, or a kind store owner would throw sticks of wood or for fuel into the little cart as the two made their way homeward. One woman in their own village often told them to keep for themselves some of the milk they carried for her. When wonderful things like these happened, Nello would happily run over the snowy paths and lanes through the dusk of evening and burst through the door of their little home with shouts of joy. Young Nello, having known nothing but this life and thinking it not much different from that of others, was thankful for God's blessings. Patrache, on the other hand, when he saw other dogs like himself being treated cruelly and having little to eat and no shelter from the cold, remembered how his life had been before. Yes, he was often very hungry when he lay down at night. He had to work in the merciless heat of summer and the chilling cold of winter, but his life was good for a dog. Many times his feet were tender, with wounds from the sharp, jagged edges of the frozen roads. The loads were heavy, and certainly he would have liked to run in the fields instead of being harnessed to a cart. Yet he did his job out of devotion to the two who had shown him so much kindness. The only time Patrache felt uneasy was when he was near one of the old churches of Antwerp. Perhaps it was how dark, dreary and lifeless they were, or maybe it was the bells that often rang from their high steeples and hurt Patrasha's ears. One of these great churches was a tribute to a long-dead hero of Antwerp, the great artist Peter Paul Rubens. The old church was a memorial to him for his contribution to art. Though now long dead, Rubens helped make Antwerp a famous city. It is good for a city and a country to have heroes, but still they are only men. If they recognise that their gifts and talents are God-given, they will want their work to bring glory and honour to Him, and not to themselves. Men can build great monuments to honour their heroes, but in the end a monument to a person, however great he may have been, can never bring new life to those who visit it. Those who visited the great church in Antwerp to see Rubens' famous paintings of Christ needed to know and honour not Rubens, but the one whom Rubens tried to picture on canvas. One day as Nello and Patrash passed the great church in Antwerp, glistening white in the sun and with spires soaring high into the blue sky, some people were coming out. The boy and dog stopped and watched them for a few moments. Their heads were bowed and their faces pale. They left silently, sadly. Nello understood why. He, too, had gone into the church in the past with Grandfather Yehan. They had both left the same way these people felt. Left, sad and empty feeling inside. Nello knelt and stroked Patrash. They are sad, he explained, because they are seeking for peace and for hope. They will not find it in this church. Like those poor souls, Grandfather Yehan and Nello had sought for peace there also. They had paid a few coins, going without food to do so, just to see the two veiled pictures painted by Rubens that hung inside. The man in the black robes and silver chains promised that would help. He said they should look at the picture of the Saviour placed on the cross, and then at the other picture showing his dead body being taken down from the cross before his resurrection. Like the other people, they thought just looking at the pictures would somehow fill their emptiness. It did not. No picture or statue or altar, no matter how magnificent, can take away sin and give one peace. That was before Nello and Grandfather Yehan had visited the old grey church in the village, the one across from the ruddy brown windmill. It was small and tumble down. The pews were rough and hard, the floor bare and cold. Not much sunlight came through the narrow old windows, and the walls badly needed paint. No beautiful pictures hung there. The loveliness was something felt rather than seen. When the small group met there, and the pastor humbly preached, it was as if God spoke. Nello and Grandfather Yehan had found peace and hope there. They had felt the burden of sin lifted, and it had cost them nothing. The old church across from the windmill, that is where we found what we were looking for, Patrash, said Nello. Yes, it had happened there one lovely Easter morning. Grandfather Yehan had been too stiff and too sore to walk to the great church in Antwerp. Even in their village he could hear the music from the bells in the high steeples of Antwerp, but he could not get there. It broke his heart. He had held back a few coins to put in the box, but he could not go. That was when the one small bell in the old grey church across from the windmill began to ring, inviting Easter worshippers. Only a very few accepted the welcome. Most had already gone to Antwerp, or did not want to be bothered with church anywhere. I cannot walk to Antwerp, Nello, Grandfather Yehan had said, so we will go to the old church in our village. That will be better than nothing. I just trust my coins will be well spent there. Perhaps some peace will be mine, even if my stomach is empty for it. They had gone, and there they heard for the first time what God truly said about sin. The coins, so precious, were not enough to pay the price for forgiveness of sin and for real peace within. It had to be paid in blood. Grandfather Yehan could not pray. Nello could not pay. For God's Son had already paid with his precious blood. Now, as Nello and Patrash stood watching the worshippers, Leaving the great Antwerp church, Nello confided, "We no longer come here to see the pictures, but I still admire the great artist who made this town remembered." Indeed, Nello spent much of his time dreaming of being a great artist himself. He was very poor and he could not read or write, but he had a gift from God. The gift was in his head and in his fingers. It was the gift